professor of economics at Harvard, the director of Rappaport Center, and the author of Triumph of the City. And really the person who kind of made cities cool before they were cool again over the last decade. And so thrilled that you're here. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this. So I wanted to start off, so we'll set it up. I'm going to ask 3 or 4 questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. So be thinking of your questions. Recently, there was an article in The Guardian, I think, about London starting to develop kind of the pattern of wealthy people coming into the city center, taking up more and more residential land and pushing the poor out to the suburbs. You've said before that cities shouldn't apologize for having poor people. In fact, that one of the reasons we see a large poor population in cities is their opportunities are better in cities. And so when we look at kind of this Paris pattern being repeated in London, we see it in some US cities, places like San Francisco. How should we be thinking about the ideal kind of structure of cities going forward, especially in terms of the access of lower income people to cities, and how do we get there?
It's a great question, and I just wanted to thank you all for staying, right, at 6 o'clock, and you've all got places to go and people to see, so thank you very much for staying and having this conversation with me, and you know, I'm particularly grateful to be doing it in District Hall. It's just great. I mean, this area is just so exciting, and watching this area rise from this former industrial space is just magnificent. And, you know, in some sense, the affordability problem, the risk that Boston faces of becoming a boutique town affordable only to the wealthy, is the downside of 40 years of success. Last night, I was doing an event remembering 40 years after the busing crisis, which was September 1974. And if you put yourself in that world, in that time, you'll just feel like you're in a completely alien Boston, right? It's the Boston of the Friends of Eddie Coyle. It's the Boston that was a declining industrial town, marked by, if anything, an abundance of cheap space. There was no problem finding affordable space in 1974 in Boston. The problem was finding a decent job or some form of economic excitement. We have had, as a city, just an unbelievably successful 40 years. And that's come through many things, but above all, it's come through smart, innovative entrepreneurs, many of them linked to universities in the area. I'm always embarrassed to admit that surely the more important university in this was MIT rather than Harvard, but we played our role too. The city really has come back in an amazing way, and we see it around us, particularly here. But the downside of that is that the space becomes rarer, especially if you don't build a lot. Now that's London's problem. So London also was a gritty town in the 70s and early 80s. I remember it quite well from those years. And it was a town that was much more affordable. Today, London is expensive, and it's expensive in part because it is extremely difficult to build in London. London has very fierce protection of its historically relevant spaces. And as a result, they don't deliver a lot of new space. Boston also has often made it fairly difficult to build. Now, part of that is completely understandable. Part of that is the fact that we have special old spaces that give this city its character. But if robust demand for a particular place collides against immovable supply, you get high prices. This is where Jane Jacobs, in so many ways I revere as an urbanist, got it wrong. Because she looked at old spaces, noted they were cheap, and new spaces, noted they were expensive, and concluded that the right way to promote affordability was to make sure nobody built any new spaces on top of old spaces. Well, how'd that work out for her in Greenwich Village, right? Where she fought so hard to create a historic preservation district, frozen amber, right? And it is a place now where townhouses start at $8 million. Right? That can't happen to Boston. That shouldn't happen to Boston. Certainly we can protect Beacon Hill, certainly we can protect the important space, but we need to make sure we are delivering enough new space. And it's not as if the new space that needs to go on here itself will necessarily house people who are poor, but it will reduce some of the pressure to gentrify other areas. So I think ultimately affordability is about the delivery of space, but it's also about transportation. It's also about making sure, I mean, we still have a lot of cheap space in the city. When you look at the sort of distribution of housing values, there still is a lot of areas that just feel very cut off. Now, part of the disadvantage of making them less cut off is pressure from middle income people to move into lower income areas just leads to its higher cost for the people who are currently living there, which again gets us back to the need for supply.
Great, thank you very much. I heard you say one time that every city government is in the business of inclusion. Social and economic inclusion, can you talk about that a little bit? And as city governments, it's kind of a little bit of a follow-up on the question about access, but for lower income populations, for lower skilled populations, how should city governments be thinking about promoting careers, opportunities for a broad segment of their population?
So that's the flip side of the affordability side, right? I mean, we risk becoming a city that is marked by just rich and poor. Now, I'll defend that, right? I'll defend urban inequality because that is economic diversity, just as I will denigrate suburban equality, right? The community that I will get in my car and go home to when I leave here is in many ways a much more equal place than Boston is, and there's nothing about that to like, right? That's the fact that suburban communities make it impossible to actually deliver housing for the poor, make it impossible to get around without a car wherever you go. So cities actually, need to cherish the fact that they provide places for people with less means to locate. They need to actually cherish the fact that they actually attract poor people. But at the same time, they have an obligation to be about economic opportunity. They have an obligation to be about inclusion. And the U.S. has a huge problem. It's not specifically an urban problem, but it is a huge problem of leaving far too many Americans without great economic opportunity going forward. We see this, I think, even more in the joblessness numbers than we do in the income numbers. When I was born in 1967, 1 in 20 prime-age males were jobless. Today, that number is 17%. Right? It's not an issue of the current Great Recession. It's an issue of a 45-year pattern, 47-year pattern, where the joblessness rate being out of work has risen over and over again. Right? Typically, it rises during a recession, and it jumps back, but it doesn't jump back all the way. It jumps back a little bit of the way. That is a huge challenge that we face, because in fact, we really need the whole city to have access to some sort of a better future. The most important element, the most important tool we have for that is school. Schools are our weapon for inclusiveness, right? And it doesn't mean that schools are the only weapon, but they have gotten better. They should continue to get better. Well-targeted pre-K programs are good. I think we can be smarter about vocational training. I think it's unlikely that the Madison Park model, which doesn't seem to be working all that well right now, is the right one. I'm more enthusiastic about things like competitively sourced, randomly evaluated after-school vocational programs. Teach guys to code not with traditional teachers, but with people who actually know what they're doing. I think there's a big role that the innovation community can play in this, right? Mentoring, training. And I would be remiss not to mention that I'm deeply honored, along with John Barrows, to be co-chairing something that's called the Neighborhood Innovation District Committee, where our job is to design something like this in an innovation district, although presumably with fewer shiny buildings, that would go in a poor area in Boston. And the idea here is not to design an innovation district for Dudley Square, for Dorchester, for Alston, that would be driving people to locate there and would begin. Instead, it's an innovation district that would be an experimental model that could presumably be scaled up. So imagine having one-stop permitting in this area, and then imagine it for the city. Imagine having a better system of agglomerating the myriad funds that exist to support lower-income entrepreneurs. Imagine delivering that in a more effective way. Imagine having a committee of mentors that was focused on that particular community, and then imagine growing it as well. So it would be a place to test, to try things out. And I just want to end on one thing, which is why I think experimentation and evaluation is so critical in government. That anyone who's involved in the sort of normal world of entrepreneurship, you've got regular signposts of success or failure. You know whether or not anyone's buying your product. You know whether or not anyone's coming to your website. You know whether or not venture capitalists are signing up. Right? Governmental programs often occupy some netherworld where it's just not clear if things working or not working. Right? And that's why we need to have a system that actually enables constant experimentation and constant evaluation, and why that's so important in the world of government.
So you're an exception to this in your role in promoting innovation in all Boston neighborhoods, your service now to the Innovation District committees. So you're an exception to this question. But one of the things I've noticed as a practitioner is how divorced practice is from theory. And when I was studying urban economics, one of the things I noticed was how divorced theory was from practice. How do we think about, and it's really, of course, it harms both of them. How do we think about this? How do we solve this? What way forward might there be for this? Who is it? Is it a university stepping up? Is it a city-university partnership? How do we think about better entwining those worlds?
I think the partnerships are moving ahead, you know, as in my capacity as director of the Rappaport Institute, which I'm stepping down at the end of December. But it's been a great 10 years. It's been a great 10 years in part because the city has been just such a terrific partner in terms of being open to all sorts of things. And the more innovative you have a city government, and you know, Boston city government has been wonderful. Office of Newark Mechanics, for example, this very innovation district. The more that it's open for innovation change, the more natural it becomes a partner with academic communities that are also in that business. But one particular, again, getting us back to the sort of randomized trial and evaluation, the sort of wonky thing, right? The more that cities are open for doing that, the more academics line up to actually want to be part of that. So the more rigorous the evaluation is, the more likely you are to get academics to want to be part of this for free. And I think that's at least one potential look forward. And I do agree with you. It's often not that academics are so crucial in terms of coming up with ideas. The guys who work in City Hall are plenty smart. It's not so much that we necessarily have ideas that they haven't thought of, but we can actually say things publicly often in a way that they can. Particularly, we can say things that are politically unpalatable at the point in time, and then watch that change over time. So I can talk about the advantage of having congestion pricing in Boston, you know, charging people to drive on credits all I want. I'm not running for anything, right? I can say this over and over again, and you know, in the same sense that Milton Friedman started talking about charter schools, in this case voucher schools, 50 years ago, right? Then it was political poison. He wasn't running for anything. He said it for 30 years, and it became charter schools. We gave a real idea that was out there. That's part of our job, is to say things that people in government can't say because they actually need 51% of the people to vote for them.
This is going to be my last question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But your name actually came up at the end of the last panel. And someone said, wow, when Ed Glaeser started his career, we thought about cities in a much different way. You've been thinking about cities for a long time. Certainly, if there's a renaissance or a resurgence, it's a great time for cities. In your career, what's the single biggest change that you think you've seen in either the perception of cities or how cities actually function? Certainly, if you go back to Boston in the 1970s, you could keep people here all night, right, in terms of what the differences are. But kind of broadly, how do we think about, what's the thing that when you're sitting at your desk, you think, I never thought I would have seen this or read this, or how, in terms of how cities have changed?
Well, there are a couple of striking things. I'm not sure I can name one. A health gap favoring cities, right? So now life expectancies are longer for people who live in cities than outside them, right? This is so outside the historic norm, right? Where, you know, a boy born in New York City in 1900 would expect to live 7 years less than the national average. It's contagious disease, you know, made cities killing fields. This isn't gone, right? I mean, we have an Ebola epidemic in Africa right now, right? The cities of the developing world still face many of those old demons, but life expectancies are longer right now in Boston and New York than they are in rural America. No one understands why life expectancies why death rates are lower for older people in Boston. It's not that nobody has ideas. Lots of people have ideas. More walking around, more social connections. There are lots of ways in which we can think of city living as being healthier. But no one's been able to nail this one from a social science point of view. Among younger people, the data just scream out. It's about two things: suicide rates and motor vehicle accidents. Right? It's just a lot safer to get into the T after you've had a few drinks than it is to get behind the wheel of an automobile. The suicide thing is a little bit puzzling. One variable that very strongly correlates with suicide rates among the young is actually hunting licenses per capita. So in fact, it may well be that just the greater gun culture in rural America has something to do with people who are predominantly killing themselves with guns. That's certainly one hypothesis, but whatever it is, the low suicide rates in cities also belie the vision of cities as places of misery. I would say in terms of, though, if you want to think about sort of cities changing on a grand scale, it's not about the US. I mean, it is awesome that Boston and New York are in so much of a better place than they were 40 years ago. It's a fantastic thing, right? It's exciting, it's fun, it's a wonderful thing to be part of. But the really amazing changes are China, like Sub-Saharan Africa. I spent a week in Zambia working on urban promise. Everyone thought I was Mr. Hart. I was, of course, working on clean water in Zambia, which was pretty cool too. And those problems are really, those places are really amazing. They both offer economic promise in a way that was unthinkable, right, in rural Africa. At the same time, there are demons that come with density, like contagious disease. And managing those demons, making cities habitable, requires competent management, requires good government, right? These are places that have become urban without becoming rich and without becoming well-governed. And as a result, all the things that we expect and get from City Hall here, that's a lot harder to get in a country where per capita incomes are less than $2,000, right? I mean, just to give you one factoid on this, the scope of the change. In 1960, what share of countries with per capita incomes below $1,000 were more than one-third urbanized? Let me repeat that. What share of countries that had per capita incomes below $1,000 in current dollars, so really poor countries, what share of those countries had more than one-third of their population living in cities? The answer is 0. There was not one. Today, more than 40% of such poor countries are more than one-third urbanized. There has been a massive increase, a massive change in the world where to be poor meant for all of human history to be rural, and it is no longer the case. And these changes are, I believe, fundamentally for the good. They are, in fact, great challenges, and they really do require sort of catching up in terms of the quality of government. So I think it's health and the urbanization of the poor world are the largest strategies.
Great, thank you. So I want to open it up to the floor for questions. I think Carlos has a mic. Scott, can you, Carlos, can you get Scott? Oh, Kevin has one for you.
Oh, thanks. A number of us were at this gubernatorial forum last week that the Mass Tech Leadership Council put on, and you know, one of the ideas about how do you create more jobs and more growing companies in places like Springfield or North Adams or Pittsfield was, you know, start incubators, start co-working spaces, sort of take the Boston model and put it in Springfield or put it in North Adams. Do you feel like there is a way to make that work? Because when I visit those cities, often I'm just struck by the total lack of density of people doing entrepreneurship, and certainly the lack of venture capital, the lack of an angel network, you know, all these things that kind of underpin the Boston innovation economy.
It's certainly a lot easier to imagine this happening in Dudley Square. And indeed, when we think about a neighborhood innovation district in a poor area in Boston, we are thinking partially about tech entrepreneurs coming there. Quite honestly, in part because the space will be cheap, right? And it's really not very far away. I mean, it's an easy shot on the Silver Line, and it's not at all difficult to get there. And also, we're thinking about entrepreneurship that's not tech. Not everyone who lives in that neighborhood is naturally going to be a tech entrepreneur, although some of them might. They're going to have great ideas in other dimensions. Springfield becomes harder. Now, I would say there are things that Springfield should be doing that relate to entrepreneurship. You know, there's not a city in Boston that I don't believe shouldn't go over its rules and regulations that make things difficult for new firms with a fine-tooth comb and get rid of those things that are barring entrepreneurship. Right? I mean, my usual line for what's the right local development policy to encourage entrepreneurship is attract and train smart people and then get out of their way. Right? So that means the low-hanging fruit there is to get out of their way. So that seems like something that both gubernatorial candidates should be supporting. You know, if you want some real estate tax break for incubator space, that's fine. I wouldn't be opposed to that. I guess I wouldn't necessarily be all that hopeful about that. But I think it's miracles do happen, and you know, I'm always going to be rooting for Springfield, but it's not obvious that this is going to be any kind of easy path.
And thanks very much. It's always a pleasure to listen to your thoughts on these topics. There's an interesting challenge that we're facing in Kendall Square, which I'm curious about your reactions to. We have a dense cluster of innovative companies in one place there, and we've seen, we think, some benefits from that, although I'm not sure how many people have really measured the impact versus taking those firms and dispersing them. There seems to be a notion that putting them close together, they work better together, they help each other find capital, those good things. There seems to be an economic force at work. It's a little surprising that would tend to push fledgling companies out of the middle And it's not just that the middle gets valuable and more expensive and therefore harder for these companies to be there, but also that there's this interesting thing where the people who own the land would always prefer tenants with credit over tenants who don't. So at the same given rent level, you would always take Microsoft over a bunch of startups. And as a result, I think everywhere that this is sort of played out, when you kind of have a successful urban core, I mean, a financial district, a commercial urban core, it doesn't have startups. And recently MIT proposed zoning to the city of Cambridge, which Cambridge adopted, which I think you know about, where they required a certain percentage of all new space being built to be set aside in 30-day rental spaces that are 200 square foot average spaces. Basically, trying to kind of legislate through zoning the way you might try to legislate there's a certain amount of retail space or a certain amount of housing space, that there would be a certain amount of startup or innovation space. I'm curious, first of all, if you see that first trend, globally, this sort of trend of, the Wall Streets of the world don't have startups, if you will. And second, do you think there's something to the notion that that could be a missing link, as though you had city cores with no retail?
Sure. I mean, as a first statement, you're absolutely right. And this was the thing that actually Jane Jacobs was motivated by in the mistake that I mentioned earlier. I mean, she was concerned about cheap space precisely because she wanted new things, right? I mean, this is an argument she makes very strongly that new activities need cheap space. And there, she's exactly right. I mean, it's just you don't get to cheap space by finding the Greenwich Village Historic Preservation District, right? That's just not a recipe towards getting to cheap space. Is zoning for startups likely to be successful? I guess if you're going to nudge a little bit in terms of the appeals process, would I try to fast track projects that did have more space for startups? Sure. Would I be happy to do that? Would I want sort of more onerous requirements that say, look, you got to do this if you're building? I think probably not. I think I would rather not have anything going on that's sort of putting too heavy a hand on this one way or the other. Now, keep in mind, I mean, Suffolk County has a historic problem, right? One of the things that we know is so strongly associated with long-run urban regeneration is average establishment size, which at least I interpret as being about the wealth of entrepreneurial human capital in the area. Suffolk County, despite what we've got around us right now, has the largest average establishment size of any major county in the U.S. Right? Despite this fantastic stuff, and indeed, this was part of the things that motivated policymakers originally. They were concerned by this. So I think unquestionably we should have policies that make sure that we are nudging the community towards entrepreneurship. But I wouldn't hard zone. I mean, there are projects where, I also have doubts about policies that actually require too much affordable housing on site. This is essentially a tax on development, right, to require this. So, I'd like less rules about building rather than more rules about building. I do think that you can play around with other interesting things, though. I mean, for example, is it clear that we should have a property tax rather than a land tax? So let me resurrect Henry George's old idea, right? So a land tax, one of the virtues of a land tax, forget about the fact that Henry George thought that you could solve every social problem in the world with a land tax, which is absurd. But if you just think about from the perspective of encouraging new development, having a tax that does not scale up with the amount of structure that you put on it, but a tax that's based on the value of the land instead, makes a heck of a lot of sense. Because instead of actually, the tax rate trying to pull you down, the tax rate is actually in some sense pushing you up to build more. So I'd rather see things like that, and I'm perfectly comfortable with Cambridge fast-tracking flexible space. That feels like the right way to do it. I feel the same way actually about affordable housing. So do I think that we should have stronger and stronger affordable housing requirements? No, because I think that's a tax on development. Am I fine with the Wall Street Redevelopment Authority fast-tracking projects that have more little units relative to $20 million apartments? Of course I am. Right? Of course I'm fine with some nudging on the margins to get smaller units that are more appropriate for middle-class people and all that stuff.
Hi, Ali. I have a question about infrastructure. So we're talking, a lot of people are talking about building innovation districts, sort of like Dudley Square, that's fine. But to help cities like Springfield and Worcester, do you feel that building out infrastructure and tying them to sort of more mothership-like cities like Boston would allow them to achieve a density that they can't achieve on their own. I think in Worcester, there's maybe only 2 or 3 colleges, and the same thing for Springfield. And I think one of the things that in Boston is the university presence gave that critical mass of brain power and desirability to do sort of these innovative things that are happening. Those cities are at a disadvantage. So tying them back to cities like Boston through high-speed rail or other easier transportation methods, do you feel like that is a possible avenue to helping those cities become more prosperous?
It's a great question, and my answer is probably not. And so the broad lesson on infrastructure, I mean, the big takeaway I want to sell is every infrastructure project needs to be evaluated with rigorous cost-benefit analysis, right? That's the critical thing. And before we get carried away by any sort of place-making magic that the infrastructure will do, we need to ask how many people are going to be taking it, how much benefit is it going to give to those people, and is that going to add up to the $100 million a mile it's going to cost for you to run the high-speed rail down. Now, I do believe that, in fact, we can probably have improvements in the Northeast Corridor and Amtrak. So I think there are relatively cheap things that we could probably manage on Amtrak. Large-scale rail projects are enormously expensive, just enormously expensive. And if I were thinking about what I would want most for Springfield, I would want the best pre-K program in the world for those kids, right? Before I would ever want to spend, $5 billion on a high-speed rail network to get out there. Right, so you have to ask yourself about what's the alternative for the money that will generate stuff. And schooling really is key, but I think the key is to educate the kids rather than to think that it's just about a rail link with MIT. You are, of course, right. I mean, the economist who's done the most on this is Enrico Moretti, who looks at the presence of a land-grant college in a metropolitan area prior to 1940, and then shows dramatic improvements in per capita income after 1980 for those areas that had land-grant colleges. MIT is, of course, Boston's land-grant college. So that certainly is right. But I don't think having more rail links to universities is necessarily something that's going to work magic for Springfield. I would be focused on interventions that deliver real value, particularly for the children of Springfield and Worcester.
You've spoken a couple of times about education, so let me sort of take you back. It seems to me, from what you're talking about in Boston, which is true of all cities, large cities across the country, the educational system, particularly for the minorities, is of such poor quality. And albeit, let's just say it's better than it was, but it's still of poor quality. And it's not producing the workforce of the future. I mean, pushing a button on a cash register is not technology, for the future. What do you see? I mean, I'm torn many times in this argument. Everybody tries charter schools. Some of them have been very successful, some of them aren't. But still, the general educational level, the needle is not being moved, I don't know where to go with it. Do you have any thoughts in how this works into the cities of the future and innovation?
So I think, Chris, you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but my own reading of Boston's test score numbers the past 5 years have actually looked pretty good. We've had a very good five-year run. So I want to just put that on the table. That being said, your basic point I strongly agree with, which is 40 years since busing. Busing was not. Many of the proponents of busing were not proponents of busing because they were diehard integrationists. They just wanted better schools for their children. That's what motivated this thing. And in many ways, we have come an unbelievably far way from 1974, both in terms of the economy and in terms of race relations. Right? This is no longer a city that is practically defined by America's belief that it is a hub of racism. Right? And that's great. We should be enormously proud of that. But there's so much work that still needs to be done on the schooling for those kids. And I think you're exactly right. Now, what are the things that we know that do work? You're right. Charter schools are a mixed bag, but the randomized evaluation of the schools in Boston tend to show very large-scale effects. I think the case for allowing them to expand, again, not in a free-for-all. I mean, the Boston model is a highly regulated model, and I think that that's fine, right? When it comes to our kids, this is not an issue of like food trucks, where I'm basically willing to let anything that goes through the hygiene stuff and open stuff up. This is an issue in which you do need regulation of these things, but more charter schools is absolutely appropriate. The other thing, of course, we know that's critical is teacher quality, right? So teacher quality is absolutely essential. More tools to enable Boston public schools to reward the good teachers and perhaps nudge the poorly performing teachers into other occupations is probably desirable. More electronic innovation in the schools, right? So one of the things I would love to see BPS, and I'm sure there are people here who know this better than I do, I would love BPS to be the premier platform for testing out new electronic learning types within the schools. So almost assuredly, this is not an issue of just giving a kid a tablet and leaving them alone. It's a hybrid model that involves using the tablets to enable some degree of one-on-one learning at the same time that you do other things with the tablet. But you want a system in which you can actually randomize evaluation of the software as it comes up. So, Khan Academy has one way of teaching you how to solve simultaneous equations. You may have some other provider that does it. So randomize in a bunch of schools that are teaching this and evaluate which one works, and then choose the better one. We can keep on doing this and make it sort of a dynamic learning process that does this instead of doing something where you just contract with one provider and be done with it. It's just not the way that good software should work. It's not the way that good teaching would work. I would also do more. I mean, I mentioned this, I think, but I would do far more with after-school programs of a variety of sorts, because it moves towards a hybrid model that has charter-like features without challenging the traditional BPS model. So the more that we have stuff after school that can be competitively sourced, the more that we can try stuff out, first of all, on an experimental basis, and the more that we can get people who are different, right, who have new things to potentially teach in the school. So I think that's another way. And I must confess also with vocational technology training, one of the reasons I like that is some part of me is, despite the fact that I'm supposed to be an economist who only cares about money, I just don't like the idea of and I know the Europeans do this early, and the Germans even do this well, right, of tracking kids at age 13 and saying, look, you're vocational, you're liberal arts, right, and we're going to train you to be a citizen of the world, and this other group, you're going to train you to be an auto mechanic. Something about that, just as an American, just offends me. It just bothers me, because how the heck, I mean, I don't know what I'm going to be doing next year. How do we know what a 13-year-old's going to be doing 30 years from now, what the economy needs? Whereas after-school vocational training just provides a lot more of an opportunity to customize, to not to track, except insofar as you're giving kids who are interested in particular skills, the opportunity after school to do it. So those are just some ideas that I had. But again, if you're doing after-school program, part of the whole virtues is randomize and evaluate.
My name's Dan Satinsky. I participated in one of the events that the mayor held about priorities for the city, and I'm getting a little bit of the same feeling listening to you talk about the schools that I had then, which is we all are a bit utopian in terms of resources that are available. And on one hand, we can, I don't have any argument with what you're saying about how we deal with education, but where are the resources for that? Because this is it, and I'm not sure it's a local solution. I don't know what the solution, I mean, obviously it's a tax question and where resources go, but do you think that the kinds of things you're proposing can be done at the current level of resources available to the city, given all the conflicting and priorities that are also important to citizens of the city?
Well, don't forget, I've just saved you $5 billion by not building a high-speed rail link to this. So surely you would allow me to spend that. I don't think what I'm saying is actually that expensive. I don't think so. We can price these things, but I think you can do. I don't think after-school programs need to be that costly. I certainly don't think doing more stuff with, I'm not talking about increasing the parent to the student-teacher ratio, I'm talking about moving to a slightly different model with more electronic providers. I think there are lots of electronic providers who would be willing to provide this stuff on an experimental basis for very low cost. I probably should have said this to begin with as a disclosure. I'm also on the advisory board of the Gates Foundation, which means that I have no financial interest in any of this, but I am perhaps ideologically steeped in the view that technology can potentially be helpful, as Gates has been funding this stuff for a long time. But I think that there are, not just Gates, but other foundations who are interested in supporting experimental work of this kind. So I don't think the funding side is that difficult. I mean, maybe if we actually tally the price tag of this, we'd say it's impossible, but I don't really think that that's absolutely great. But, you know, on this I will admit, being 100% of an economist, I believe the city should pay their bills, and I'm not at all looking for a ratchet. If what you told me, if you know, what those costs would be a, you know, doubling of the city budget, of course I tell you that was crazy, but I just don't think when I've benchmarked it, we're talking about that. And I don't think if I were allocating money, I don't think there's anything that I would be more enthusiastic about spending money on than educating kids. I don't think there's anything that I would want to, you know, so I think if we can talk about other areas about where potentially I'd ratchet back, but I'd be happy to, there are other areas where I certainly would be happy to reduce spending in order to get more on this stuff.
I work for a local development company. We're doing the 23 acres around the Innovation District right now. And sorry to change gears from some obviously highly important local issues. I'm curious to know whether you think Paul Romer's concept of charter cities has any credence, especially given, you know, your focus on the global city growth.
Okay, we're going to do some disclosures on this. Paul Romer and I have been friends for 27 years. I'm on the advisory board at this center that he's the acting director of at NYU, and he's a very good friend. So the idea of charter cities is basically the idea of, could you create a Hong Kong in sub-Saharan Africa, a place that's independent, that can try out different rules, that can provide rule of law, but it needs to be independent of the current government, right? So whatever country we're talking about, imagining a country that has lots of corruption problems, that has lots of violence problems. Can you actually have a country that actually cedes control? In fact, he had a country that was initially willing to do it, but then sort of seized it back and turned it into a local real estate play. The idea was widely denigrated by people on the left as sort of neo-imperialism, as some sort of view that, you know, this is some bad American economist who is proposing something that is, you know, grafting Western values onto other countries. I don't think those views are, I don't hold with those views. I think that the vision, if it can be put in, offers the possibility of safety. It's all voluntary. No one has to come to these areas. In his vision, it was going to be a pretty draconian setup. So you couldn't use, for example, one of his clever ideas is you couldn't use cash in the city. Everything had to be electronic, so you could track corruption. Anyone who's spending cash would be, lots of interesting things around this, voluntary. Now, I, of course, because I'm a different sort of economist than Paul, I tend to see, you know, I'm the sort of economist who, when faced with something like this, asks, well, why hasn't someone done it already, and if it's such a great idea? And, you know, you're trying to do this in a poorly governed country, they're gonna screw you somehow. It's not gonna work. So that was my reaction, but at the same time, I held out hope for this. So, and Paul is a pretty remarkable person. So I'm rooting for him, certainly. I'm rooting for anything that, you know, shows better city governance in the developing world. But I do see an awful lot of challenges on this. And I guess you know, 50-50 right now with him. He gets one of these in the next 20 years, but that's a made-up number.
Same type of, I live over in Cambridge. With this, couple of points. Questions?
Republic of Cambridge?
The People's Republic of Cambridge. Why should we not tax developers? Just to make a couple of points on that before you answer. This building is a tax on developers it's affordable housing for the high-tech startup group. This whole land around here was only opened up because of a huge tax transfer courtesy of Tip O'Neill called the Big Dig. So that's a point for just response. A point about space in cities. I mean, the challenge with space in cities and buildings is that they're not as flexible and fluid as economists would like, right? It takes a lot to build a building, and then a building, frankly, should stay there for a while. And so I'd ask that question in the context of all our environmental concerns. If it's going to take this much carbon to put a building up, should we be as flexible about, well, let's just tear it down because we have a different economy, we have a different market, we have different needs coming out. So, two different points just for your.
Sure. Okay. Both good points. First of all, I'm not against all taxes on development at all, right? I mean, first of all, there are, you know, what economists call negative externalities occasionally from building, and we should expect, you know, people to pay for them. Much of those will be covered by real estate taxes per se. right? So I'm not advocating a complete drop of property taxes. I'm advocating that we do more to tax land and maybe a little bit less to tax structure. I also believe and have long advocated having a fast track for development that you actually pay for. So instead of paying for 8 years of uncertain, process, you pay a larger fee up front and you get the ability to build more quickly. No part of me wants to give stuff away to builders, but I want to make sure that we don't do any more than we already do to deter the supply of new space. Now, the environmental stuff is somewhat interesting because it's not at all clear which direction that goes. So, and there are two ways to think about this. One of which is just if you held the number of units constant in an area, would you be environmentally better off or worse off if you put new units down? Now, there's certainly a bit of energy consumed when you do the building. So that's one part of the calculation. But then almost assuredly, the new stuff that you put in is going to be significantly more environmentally friendly than the old stuff that was there, right? So think about Boston's, universal triple deckers, right? These are not great friends of the environment, these buildings, right? These are, very far away from what you would do if you were doing modern buildings in terms of the energy consciousness. So that isn't obvious. And I'll make a further point of this, which is what I've just said holds the number of units constant, right? So let's say instead of holding the number of units constant, you increase density tenfold, right? So we added a lot of new people to the city. Now, is that an environmental win or an environmental loss? Now, if your job is just reducing Boston's emissions, right, which I think is never the right way to think about it, then maybe it's a loss. But that's not our job, right? Our job is to reduce emissions everywhere, right? Our job is to reduce the world's emissions, and almost surely having this increase in the number of people living in downtown Boston relative to, the exurbs is a big environmental win. So together with Matthew Kahn, I've put together an estimate of the marginal carbon emissions associated with living, and this is just from transportation and the household sector living in different parts of the country. There are, of course, large differences across metropolitan areas. So by far the greenest place in terms of just a straight metro area to live in the country is California, right, by far. And it's not the regulations, it's just the bloody climate, okay? Because in fact, if you look at both electricity and gas use, electricity use lines up on July temperature, and the heating energy stuff lines up on January temperature, right? And California's got mild winters and mild summers, right? So in fact, that's why I'm so glad that all of the California environmentalists are fighting so hard to allow new building in California and to make it really easy to deliver massive amounts of building around the San Francisco Bay, which is of course where, if you really wanted to reduce carbon emissions, you would actually do it. Instead of having the Save the Bay Foundation, which has been working for 50 years to stop anyone from building around California, the real environmentalists would be out there campaigning for more and more buildings, right, outside of Berkeley, because that's actually smart environmentalism. And I think the same thing now. Boston is good on summers, bad on winters, but within metropolitan areas, central cities trump suburbs by a significant margin, right? And that's coming from two things, one of which is holding income and family size constant, and that's one of the things that's usually missing from the sort of general carbon footprint, because the people who live in the suburbs are just different people. They have larger households, they often have more income. But holding income and family size constant, urbanites use less energy, and they use it typically because they're living in smaller housing units, and because they're using a lot less in transportation. And in transportation, the critical thing to remember is in most of America, this actually doesn't mean the T, right? This means driving. I mean, in fact, even the majority of Bostonians aren't using public transportation to get around. But and outside the US, it's all about driving. But look, the difference in carbon emissions between driving 5 miles and driving 50 is huge. And that's the difference of sort of the urbanite versus the non-urbanite. And I know about this personally because when I started acquiring small children about 8 years ago, right? I moved from Cambridge, where I used essentially no energy, to a suburb where just heating the house, I feel like we're personally melting the polar ice caps. So it's that story.
Hiya, I'm from the Kennedy School, so good to see you here. So when we study cities and great examples, a lot of times we look at leading cities. So I was wondering, in terms of attracting human capital and innovation, what are some of the emerging or up-and-coming cities that you really like that you can give us a favorite example of what they're doing right and what you like about them?
Well, so there are lots of things to, there are lots of exciting things obviously going on all over the world. I have a my father actually came to the U.S. from Berlin in 1962, so I go back to Berlin with some degree of regularity, and obviously Berlin is an incredibly exciting place. It's incredibly exciting in the arts, incredibly exciting in cultural areas. And it's also got new buildings. And one of the things that's interesting is that so much of Europe is held, for good or bad, under the grips of historic preservation in a variety of ways. I mean, you're not changing Paris in any major way, and we know that. The one architectural style that apparently everyone's decided that they're willing to do away with is the stuff that was built during the Warsaw Pact era, right? Even the Nazi buildings they'll keep. But the Warsaw Pact buildings, right? They got to get rid of the Warsaw Pact buildings. They hate them, right? And I think, you know, I have no claim. I may be the son of an architectural historian, but I certainly make no claims for any aesthetic judgment myself. But you know, I think you can understand why they had these preferences. But that means, in fact, that Berlin builds, right? So you have this sense of old and new buildings speaking together. And for me, at least, I love Copple Square. I love the marriage of Ian Pei and H.H. Richardson in a space. I love it when there's a dialogue between architects of the past and the present together. And that at least to me, helps make Berlin particularly exciting. I think when you look in Asia, it's hard not to be impressed by Seoul. I mean, I think, particularly for, look, I mean, at least my experience is sort of, I am, of course, very philo-Japanese, as many people are, but Tokyo is a very closed city, has as much of Japanese culture, right? I mean, unless you are someone who has some incredibly deep understanding of the Japanese world, it's very, very hard to feel like you're really getting it. Whereas Korea is very different. Korea is much more open to the world. In some sense, it positions Seoul as being, you know, almost a rival with Singapore and Hong Kong as being a place that's actually open to the wider world. And of course, you know, I'm always in love with India's cities, but you know, I mean, never has the combination of incredible, you know, private entrepreneurship and public failures been so obvious, right? I mean, it's sort of this, you know, incredible mismatch between you just, you know, cheer at what, you know, Indians are doing in Mumbai or Bangalore or Gargan, and you then say, why the heck can't you get a government that's in any sense worthy of you? I seem to be going back to talk to these builders in Colombia every year, and I feel like I have to say something about Medellin, right? Which, when I was a kid, and Pablo Escobar, not when I was a kid, when I was in college, right? It was, you know, crime and cocaine and death rates, and you know, today it's still twice as deadly as New York was in the 70s when I was growing up. So it's still not completely safe, although for tourists it's not that. I mean, it's like, so often, tragically, crime is focused on the poor. But it's fun, it's charming, it's a lovely city, it's a place actually to, you know, and it's a place to be in that has the fun of Latin America without the, you know, I mean, we also love Rio, but Rio is tough, right? And Sao Paulo is even tougher in terms of the negotiations. So that's my.
Hi, my name is Pam. I'm from Detroit. We have this tension in Detroit among the funding community in terms of how we spend our time and resources on accelerating innovation, technology commercialization, and startups versus helping to build up and support small businesses and neighborhoods. And especially when there's this real emphasis on inclusion, and we find that when we're spending most of that time and resources in innovation and technology commercialization and startups, it doesn't seem as inclusive. What are your thoughts on how we should be balancing that and the relationship between the two?
Well, Detroit is, I mean, you know, Detroit above all needs economic energy. I mean, I would be focusing on two things in Detroit. So I would be focused on the inclusion side, it's got to be about the schools. And I would, given where Detroit public schools are, I would be considering even, I'm going to be totally outrageous here because that's the academic's job, I would be open to the New Orleans model, right? Going all charter, right? Just getting rid of a malfunctioning system, but you know, obviously sufficiently regulated, but moving to that model. But I would, when I'm focused on inclusion, I would be focused on educating the children of Detroit to a much higher standard because that's the most critical thing. When I'm focused on entrepreneurship, sure. Do I want to think about entrepreneurial human capital as being taught as well? Do we want mentoring programs? Do we want things that are helpful? Absolutely. But the first order of business is getting more, you know, enterprise into Detroit. So I would have one lens. I would, you know, use schooling for inclusion because that's what it's good at. That's what it's meant for. Use entrepreneurship for generating economic activity because that's what that's meant for. So don't try to do everything with every policy. it just doesn't make sense.
Hello, my name is CD. I'm from the Republic of Somerville. So my question is related, I guess, almost to the same idea that he was talking about. Why against taxation? Because if we see any big city, for example, like New York, where anything good starts happening, like the gentrification starts happening, the good thing that attracted the cool people and the vibe to that city or that place gets driven out to some other place. And these kind of things actually help keep that culture, which I think in the end is the most interesting part of a city. So for example, Wall Street is a horrible public space, social space, because there's these big corporations there and nobody is actually occupying this, in general. But the cool places like Brooklyn, for example, where the cool kids are going to live now, they're getting kicked out of there. So two questions: why not taxation? I really don't understand that. And then two, why do you see some sort of debt of these big cities where they become these big economic sort of centers? They're trying to push things that grow the economy, but in the end kills the city from a social point of view. That's my question.
Why not what taxation? What taxation do you think that I was opposed to?
When Timur was talking about sort of rules that help startups stay in Kendall Square, for example, if they get kicked out of there, 10 years from now, that might become just a global, a corporation kind of center, but then it kills the entrepreneurial community that started it and that made it exciting.
Just think about how heavy-handed this is going to be. So require 20% for all projects to include startup space. How are you going to monitor how exactly they're defining startups? How are you going to, you're putting this, huge bureaucratic imperative on this in a way that feels completely counter to the way that startups operate. Right? So it's not that I'm against sort of encouraging cool stuff. I'm very much in favor of encouraging cool stuff. It's that, in fact, putting cool stuff into the hands of a, bureaucracy that has to monitor everything. Everyone who occupies the space is going to be visited by city inspectors on an annual basis to make sure that they are actually still startups. And are you still a startup? We're now 3 years in. Are you still a startup? Maybe you're not a startup anymore. Maybe you're an established company. Now you've got to get out of that space because, in fact, we got rules here. So you're going to have some guy walking around with your Somerville Housing Authority thing and his little pen asking you about your business model and did you conform to that. I don't want that. I don't want more rules about this thing. I want something that enables more economic freedom, not less. Now, New York has a problem from overconcentration in finance. I agree with that. So at its height, 42% of the payroll in the island of Manhattan was in finance and insurance. It's too much, and the track record of one industry towns is not great, as Detroit suggests. The key is but you've got to ask yourself what can be productively done in here. And you certainly don't want less finance. That's not actually what you want. You want the revenues that come from that. Remember, these guys are the things that are funding a huge amount of other stuff. They're funding the philanthropy that's going on in Harlem's Children's Zone. They're funding the city revenues. You don't want to have an attitude that says that the people who actually make money are somehow or other evil. This is not a good recipe for urban regeneration. And anyway, there's a sound reason why finance loves cities, right? The great advantage of cities in the 21st century is enabling the flow of information, is enabling us to get smart by being around other smart people. This is what cities do that matters. There's no industry in which having a little better information is more valuable than finance. Get used to it. Finance is going to be staking the cities forever. The key is to make sure that it is easy enough to do other stuff in cities. Right? The key is to make sure that there is enough space to do other stuff. The key is, this is why I supported Bloomberg's attempt to put a science campus in the East River, was an attempt to support the tech side of New York. This is why, I think it's great that we have an innovation district here, with the idea of doing new activities here. But it's not an issue of being punitive about this. Now, certainly, and that's why I asked about the clarification of your tax question. Certainly, I want the finance guys to pay taxes. Of course, I want them to pay taxes. I want perfectly robust property taxes on this activity. But I don't want to view them as villains, and I don't want to castigate them. And I do want to make it, as possible, as easy as possible to build new stuff for new activities.
So I want to ask you a little bit of a personal follow-up on that. So you're a native of Manhattan. The Times has been following the development of Manhattan. A couple of things. One is the tremendous loss of bookstores in Manhattan. And then a lot of hand-wringing around Union Square Cafe getting priced out. So Manhattan feels different than it felt 10 years ago. It must feel really different than it felt 20 or 30 years ago. And there is a homogenization of large cities where you feel like CVS, Starbucks, you know exactly the feel. Does this end? How sort of personally, when you think about cities, as we think about kind of the cool factor is kind of being bled from places like Manhattan and now perhaps Brooklyn. How do we think about it? Will this correct itself, or Quincy becomes cool, Jersey City becomes cool? How does this play out? How do you feel about it personally?
Well, that, I mean, certainly to some part it makes me sad. Of course it does. I mean, of course, I miss the grittier Manhattan of my youth in lots of ways. As much as I cheer for many of the things that happen. In part, this has a migration to lower cost areas within the city. Right, so this is Brooklyn, and now other areas coming back, and you don't want to deprive them of coolness by having Manhattan monopoly on coolness, just as if you don't want the Innovation District to own all the coolness in Greater Boston. I mean, it's okay that some of it moves elsewhere, and in fact, you also want some coolness some coolness in Detroit. You want some coolness in Pittsburgh. You want coolness all over the place. It's not in any sense obvious that some degree of migration to areas where costs are lower is necessarily a terrible thing. That being said, I think we can probably do a little bit more. And indeed, if you think about managing space from the perspective of let's say you were a mall owner, right? Mall owners are actually often quite bad at this, but you'd actually want to curate the space well. You'd actually want to, and neighborhoods have a feeling like that, right? So Harvard, I mean, I know a little bit about this, Harvard for decades has engaged and used its ownership to slightly curate Harvard Square, right? To make Harvard, to enable shops that might have been priced out for chains to give them lower prices and so forth. The problem is, as much as I revere the guys in City Hall, I don't want them really in this job, right? I don't want them in the job of personally picking, well, you're a cool business, so we're going to subsidize you, and you're not cool. Sorry, I know you're a bookstore and you've been around here for 40 years, but your books are bad, and we just don't want you anymore. It doesn't, city governments are not good at this. So I wondered if there were ways to sort of crowdsource this with, and this particularly came up with all the anger about, you remember there was a year and a half ago, this seems to have died down, the banks taking over. So there was a temporary movement in which everyone was angry because bank space was everywhere. And I agree with those who think that having vast amounts of bank frontage does not make for exciting urban spaces in a variety of different ways. So the question was whether or not you should have some tax on bank frontage that was light enough, and I think I probably came down against that. But I wanted to have some way of generating some pool of money that could then get allocated on the basis of people in the neighborhood voting on which buildings or structures that they wanted. So if you could create some little cache of money that you then allocated based on crowdsourcing it, and not a huge thing, not a massive government policy thing, but just something to help in a little way, I would feel slightly better than that, than bureaucratizing that and putting it through government. So, but I think also some part of it we're going to have to accept as being inevitable. You have neighborhoods change, and we can nudge on the margins, but the tendency of new cool things to move to where areas are somewhat cheaper is going to persist. Of course, there are creative ways that we can push against that, right? Smaller offices, right? That's part of the virtue of things like CSC, right? That you're not actually requiring huge offices for everyone, and once you're down to a smaller space, you can actually afford to live in an area in which square footage costs are lower. So I think it's something to continue fighting on, but again, I worry about trying to bureaucratize cool. I mean, those two things don't seem to go very well together, right? So I feel like I do want to end on one last thing about regulations, though, because this is what we're talking about innovation. And one of the things that I've loved, and this does relate to space, is the food truck runs in Boston, right? And freeing the food truck has been a pet cause to me for many years. I feel as a young, impecunious professor, I ate a lot of the food truck that was parked in back of our building when I was working hard to get tenure. So I feel like I owe a debt to the food truck. So I've written a couple of columns on freeing the food truck, and all of a sudden I found myself, and this is a Detroit story, I found myself on a NPR show about this poor woman who became a cause célèbre because she couldn't start her food truck in Detroit, right? Because the regs were just killing her. For a year and a half, she'd been trying to start a food truck. No, right? And the idea that Detroit should be saying no to any entrepreneur, right, seems like madness to me, right? That the first order thing is you just want to start the business. But the great moment for me at the end of the call was they had the poor city ombudsman on the line, who was being beaten up for an hour. And he finally, totally giving up, says, "Look, lady, just start your food truck. We'll never catch you."
Great, so I think we couldn't end on better words than that. So thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.